A government representative, impeccably dressed in a sharp black suit, unceremoniously pushed a contract across to the hospital bed where the story's protagonist lay. Emblazoned on official Department of Defense letterhead was a staggering sum, $278 million. This number, riddled with zeros, seemed incomprehensible to his morphine-hazed mind. All that was required of him was to sign in 3 places, initial in 7, and financial worries would forever vanish from his life. "Take your time reading it, Staff Sergeant Brennan," said the man who introduced himself as Holloway, though only a badge confirmed his identity. Every detail of his appearance screamed federal agent, from his flawlessly tied knot to his habit of avoiding direct eye contact, as if constantly calculating escape routes. However, paragraph 47, subparagraph C, concealed a treacherous catch. He was forbidden from telling anyone the truth about the events of that fateful day in Afghanistan when he lost his legs. Not his comrades who survived the carnage, nor the therapists striving to help him cope with his trauma. Not even his family, who deserved to know why their son returned home broken. And certainly not Melinda, who just 6 hours prior had stood by this very bed, her pregnant belly straining against a light sundress, tears streaming down her face as she confessed she couldn't raise a child with half a man. The contract unequivocally defined the acceptable version of events: an IED blast, a routine patrol, a tragic casualty of war. No mention of the yellow gas that still burned his lungs with every deep breath. No reference to American chemical weapons discovered at an abandoned Soviet site, and certainly no word of the 2 mercenaries who held soldiers at gunpoint while extracting evidence of war crimes committed by their own government. His name was Riley Brennan. Just 3 days ago, he was a respected Army Ranger with 8 years of service, a loving, pregnant wife, and a dream of returning home in 6 weeks to start the family life he so valiantly protected. Now, he was a patient in a military hospital in Germany with 2 stumps where his legs once were, a wedding ring left on his bedside table by his wife, and a man in a black suit offering to buy his soul for a sum impossible to spend in 10 lifetimes. "Mr. Holloway," he rasped, his voice still recovering after the ventilator had been removed just yesterday, "what happens if I refuse to sign?" Holloway adjusted his cufflinks, a simple gesture that resonated like a veiled threat. "Standard veteran benefits, Staff Sergeant. 60% disability, perhaps 70% if you find a good lawyer. The Department of Veterans Affairs will provide basic prosthetics, allowing you to move, but nothing more. Rehabilitation will be in a standard facility with a 16-month waiting list. Your wife will receive no additional support for your child beyond standard dependent allowances." After a pause, Holloway produced a tablet and displayed a video. It showed Melinda in her Colorado Springs apartment, shopping with her mother. The timestamp indicated 2 hours ago. "Of course," Holloway continued, his impassive, bureaucratic tone unwavering, "we prefer voluntary cooperation. The men and women who serve their country deserve compensation for their sacrifices, especially when those sacrifices involve exposure to materials that, in essence, should not exist. Consider it insurance, Staff Sergeant, for you, for your family, for everyone you hold dear." The threat, though unspoken, was chillingly clear. Sign the contract, take the money, and everyone would be safe. Refuse, and, well, things happen to veterans suffering from PTSD. He thought of his father, Vernon, 68, still battling his Vietnam nightmares. His mother, Diane, who for 30 years pretended not to hear his screams in his sleep. His younger brother, Colton, who looked up to him as a hero, not as a man who simply led his squad into a trap that cost him his legs and possibly the lives of others. The magnitude of the offer was staggering, not just money, but the chance to blur the lines between reality and fiction, to buy a new life woven from lies in exchange for a war that had been stolen from him. "What about the others?" he asked, hoping for justice. "Jameson, Rodriguez, Chen, will they receive similar offers tailored to their circumstances?" Holloway interrupted, as if he expected the question. "Each of them will be met personally, Brennan, and the choice will be theirs. But understand, their decisions are interconnected. One refusal could jeopardize the entire program." This was not merely a bribe, but cynical blackmail cloaked in patriotic rhetoric. The future of his comrades hung in the balance. By rejecting the deal, He would betray not only himself, but also their hope for a better life. At that moment, a nurse entered the room. Her gaze flickered to Holloway and then quickly away. Everyone here knew who he was and what he represented, the man in the black suit, an emissary of covert operations, a witness to silence. "You have 24 hours, Staff Sergeant Brennan," Holloway said, rising and straightening his jacket. "Then the offer will disappear forever, along with all evidence." He left the contract on the bedside table, next to Melinda's wedding ring, which glinted in the lamplight. Two symbols defining his fate, the love he had lost and the lie he might have to live with. "And one more thing, Staff Sergeant," Holloway added at the door. "Your wife was wrong. You're not half a man. You're a hero who deserves compensation. The question is, are you smart enough to accept it?" The door closed with a soft click, like a prison cell locking shut. He was left alone with 278 million reasons to betray the truth and a wedding ring, a stark reminder of the price he had already paid. For many years, the habit of waking at 4:30 a.m. without an alarm had become ingrained. 8 years as a ranger had left their mark. Melinda, his wife, would only groan sleepily, pulling a pillow over her head as he laced up his running shoes. "You're not in Afghanistan anymore, Riley," she'd mumble through her sleep. But old habits died hard, and the morning run was a necessity, a way to stay connected to himself. Our modest home in Colorado Springs was unremarkable. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a garage with a leaky roof, and a small backyard where we dreamed of getting a dog. But it was ours, bought with my combat pay and Melinda's elementary school teacher salary. The walls of the house held our history, photos of my unit in Kandahar, our wedding day at the Fort Carson Chapel, my Ranger School graduation where I looked 10 years younger. And the most precious, Melinda's first ultrasound, held to the refrigerator by a tiny combat boot magnet. We had dreamed of a child for 3 years. Melinda had begun to lose hope, fearing that years of birth control had affected her health. I'd find her crying in the bathroom, another negative pregnancy test in her hand. "Maybe we're not meant to be parents," she'd say. I'd hold her, assuring her that everything would happen in its own time. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, while I was at training, she called me, crying with happiness. "I'm pregnant, Riley. We're having a baby." My younger brother, Colton, nearly fell off a lift when I shared the news with him. "Finally, you'll have someone else to boss around besides me," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "Nobody bosses me around but me." That was Colton's motto. He owned a small auto repair shop in the heart of town, specializing in fixing cars for those who couldn't afford dealership prices. Colton never showed interest in military service, explaining that he'd leave the heroics to me. However, I knew the real reason for his decision. He felt responsible for caring for our aging parents while I was deployed. Every Sunday, without fail, I accompanied my father, Vernon, to the American Legion Hall on the south side of town. The Vietnam War had claimed his left arm below the elbow and significantly impaired his hearing, but it hadn't broken his pride. He always occupied the same corner table, ordered the same beer, and recounted the same stories to anyone willing to listen. But when he saw me in uniform, his face transformed. He straightened up, touched my Ranger tab with his sole hand, and declared loudly enough for all to hear, "Rangers lead the way." Other veterans would nod in agreement and raise their glasses. These men understood what civilians could not. They knew the price of the tan beret and the curved scroll. My mother, Diane, lovingly prepared our sandwiches and placed them in the refrigerator, turkey and cheese for me, ham and American cheese for my father, always cutting off the crusts as if we were still children. She constantly reminded me that serving my country was noble, but the most important thing was to return home safe and sound. "I've given enough to this country," she'd say, glancing at my father's empty sleeve. "Don't make me give more." Only 6 weeks remained until my final deployment, 42 days until I could hang up my rifle and become the father I always dreamed of being. Melinda was 5 months pregnant and sent me weekly photos of her growing belly, each accompanied by a fruit comparison from some pregnancy app she was obsessed with. "The baby's the size of a mango this week," she'd write. I had already picked out a crib from a catalog, a massive oak one with sides that could convert into a toddler bed. My comrade Jameson helped me sketch out the nursery plan on a napkin during a night watch. He had a knack for spatial planning and could instantly tell how best to arrange an empty room. Everything was meticulously planned. Everything was perfect. I had already submitted my discharge papers and found a job at a security firm in Denver. Good pay, regular hours, home for dinner every night. The American dream, embodied in a DD-214 and tied with a bow. But on October 14th at 8:00 a.m., there was a briefing for a new mission. A classified operation, voluntary participation only, with corresponding hazard pay. My commander, Major Briggs, pulled me aside in the hallway. "Brennan, you have a baby on the way. No one will judge you if you decline." But I couldn't do it. Rangers don't quit. Rangers complete missions. Rangers come home victorious or die trying. Only 6 weeks to freedom, but I couldn't refuse one more mission. The task was a standard inspection of a facility located in the mountains beyond Herat. Intelligence reported an abandoned Soviet chemical depot from the 1980s, one of dozens left after the troop withdrawal. We had done similar assignments before: infiltrate the site, document everything, photograph serial numbers, check for active agents, call in a disposal team, and leave the area. 4 hours maximum to be back for dinner. But that day, nothing went according to plan. Already in the briefing room, the 2 CIA contractors sitting in the corner raised red flags. They didn't introduce themselves or say a word, only observed us with the gaze of people who had seen too much and didn't care. They were dressed in civilian clothes, but moved like professional operatives, men who officially didn't exist and liked it that way. Our convoy was hit by an IED 12 kilometers from the target at 1:47 p.m. The blast lifted our MRAP into the air and flipped it, as if God himself decided to play with us. My head hit the ceiling, then the floor, then the ceiling again. When we finally stopped, I was hanging upside down by my seatbelt, blood from my nose dripping onto the ceiling below me. But we were alive, all 6 of us. This should have been a sign to abort the mission. Protocol demanded it. The discovery of an IED meant the area was compromised, and the mission should be terminated. Life had fallen apart. "We're going on foot," one of the mercenaries commanded, leaving the vehicle and inspecting his weapon. It sounded like an unequivocal order. "That's against protocol," I countered, helping Jameson free Rodriguez from his seatbelt. "Your rules don't apply here, Sergeant," the mercenary snapped. He quickly contacted command via satellite phone and, receiving confirmation, announced, "Order is to proceed, urgent." And so we moved into the mountains. Myself, Jameson, Rodriguez, Chen, and the 2 mercenaries who concealed their names. They introduced themselves as Smith and Jones, as if plucked from the pages of a cheap spy novel. The facility, carved into the rock, was a massive, brutalist concrete structure. Cyrillic inscriptions on the armored doors, though faded, still warned of something. As soon as I crossed the threshold, I felt something was wrong. The dust on the floor had been recently disturbed, and fresh scratches marred the door locks. Someone had been here within the last week, perhaps even days. I raised my hand, signaling a halt, but Smith ignored me. "We're on schedule," he declared, pushing deeper into the facility. On the 3rd subterranean level, which retained the ambiance of the Soviet era, automated systems whirred to life. However, the electronics had been modernized with contemporary components. I noticed Samsung chips integrated into the old Soviet circuit boards. A thick, oily yellow gas began to seep from the ventilation shafts, enveloping everything. "Masks!" I yelled, pulling out my gas mask. We were all equipped with them, standard procedure for chemical-related sites, but a mask is only temporary protection, especially when you don't know what it's supposed to protect against. The mercenaries moved confidently, without hesitation, as if they knew every corner of the place. They headed towards a specific storage area and began extracting metal boxes, cross-referencing serial numbers with a list. "We need to leave," Rodriguez cried, pointing to the gas that had already accumulated on the floor. At that moment, Smith aimed his pistol at Rodriguez. 5 more minutes, that's all we need." "You're insane," Jameson exclaimed, attempting to approach, but Jones also drew his weapon. 4 minutes, 30 seconds, Smith stated calmly, "and we all go home rich." Those 5 minutes cost us everything. Under gunpoint, we watched the mercenaries load 6 boxes into bags, inhaling the noxious fumes. Even through the thick rubber of my mask, my eyes burned. Chen began coughing blood, which stained the inside of his mask. A sudden explosion rocked the facility. As it turned out later, a safety mechanism had triggered when the wrong box was removed without the corresponding code. The floor collapsed, and centuries-old Soviet concrete turned to dust. I remember falling into darkness, surrounded by debris, yellow gas mixed with smoke and fire. Rusty rebar pierced both my legs just above the knees. The pain was unbearable, paralyzing, transforming into white noise in my nervous system. Jameson found me under the rubble 20 minutes later. I was unconscious, my mask cracked, my legs pinned by a concrete slab, impaled by rebar. He fashioned tourniquets from his belt and shoelaces, injected me with morphine from 3 first aid kits, and carried me out from under the debris as the mountain crumbled around us. The mercenaries vanished, evaporating with the boxes, leaving us to die in that toxic tomb. The official report would state that they perished in the explosion. But 2 days later, I saw them in Bagram, loading those same boxes onto an unidentified aircraft. By the time medical evacuation arrived, my legs were already gone. The medic, assessing the situation, began the amputation on the spot. "Tissue necrosis from chemical exposure," he mumbled. "If we don't amputate now, it will spread further." I woke up in Germany 3 days later, realizing the true cost of that mission. What was the price paid for that ill-fated mission? After 2 months of rehabilitation at Walter Reed, the protagonist learned to walk again, relying on prosthetics that cost more than many people's cars. His physical therapist, Angela, a no-nonsense former Marine, allowed no room for self-pity. "Pain is just weakness leaving your body, Brennan," she'd repeat as he sweated through exercises on the parallel bars. "You Rangers are supposed to be tough, aren't you?" It was at this point that Mr. Holloway reappeared, always in his black suit, as if his wardrobe knew no variation, with the same icy gaze that avoided direct contact. He barged into the therapy room, without knocking, without permission, as if he owned the place. It was quite possible that he did. "Staff Sergeant Brennan, I need 5 minutes of your time," he said. Angela tried to object, but one look from Holloway was enough to send her out of the room. That's when it became clear this was more than simple compensation. People don't flee from government officials handling routine bureaucracy. "The October 14th incident," he began, settling into Angela's chair and making himself comfortable. "There have been some developments." He pulled out a tablet, swiping through security screens using a thumbprint and presumably a retina scan. An image of Chen's obituary from the San Francisco Chronicle appeared on the screen. "Suicide," Holloway stated. "He jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge last week, left a note about battling PTSD. Another swipe of his finger. Rodriguez confined to a hospital bed, entangled in life support wires. "Car accident. He crashed into a concrete barrier at 90 miles per hour. No brake marks. He's been in a coma for 6 days. "You're lying," he blurted out, but his voice trembled, for he felt in his gut that it was the bitter truth. "The chemical agent you were exposed to has long-term neurological consequences," Holloway continued in his dispassionate tone. "Paranoia, depression, and eventually, complete nervous system failure. Unless, of course, you receive proper treatment, experimental treatment, extremely expensive treatment." He produced a new contract, even more substantial than the previous one. $278 million, as previously agreed, plus lifelong medical coverage, including treatment that doesn't officially exist yet. Neural inhibitors capable of preventing the deterioration your comrades are experiencing. All that is required of you is to maintain the agreed-upon version of events. "What actually happened in that mountain?" he asked. For the first time, Holloway allowed himself a smile, but it was only a faint grimace that didn't reach his eyes. "You encountered an improvised explosive device, nothing more. The facility you investigated turned out to be empty, abandoned for decades. Your squad found nothing noteworthy. Those boxes Smith and Jones took. There are no Smiths and Jones. Those men don't exist in any database you will ever access." He thought of Melinda, of his unborn child who, in any case, would have to grow up without a father. She had made that clear in their last phone call. "I can't raise a child while simultaneously caring for an invalid," she had declared. "I've already been through that, caring for my grandfather. I'm not going to repeat that experience." He thought of his aging and worried parents. His father's VA pension barely covered medication costs. His mother had taken a part-time job at Walmart to help with groceries. They would never ask him for money, too proud for that. But he saw the bills accumulating on their kitchen table during Sunday lunches. Of Colton, who dropped everything to be there, sleeping in a hospital chair for 2 consecutive weeks, missing work, losing clients at his auto shop. "Don't worry about me," he had said. "Family comes first." But he knew Colton was behind on his rent. "I need proof that Jameson will receive similar terms," he demanded. Holloway brought up another document on the tablet screen. Jameson's signature was already on it, dated yesterday. A tense silence hung in the room, broken only by the ticking of a clock counting down the final minutes. On the table before the protagonist lay the contract, its white pages stark against the dark wood. Holloway's signature, dated yesterday, seemed an ominous premonition. "He was very interested in securing his daughter's future," Holloway said, his voice dry and impassive. "She has special needs, as you know. The treatment she requires demands significant financial investment." At that moment, it was as if a veil had lifted from his eyes. It became clear that they knew everything, every weakness, every pain, every person he held dear. This was not merely the purchase of silence, it was absolute subjugation. 24 hours, the protagonist reminded him, his voice muffled. "You said I had 24 hours to decide." "That was before Chen's tragic decision and Rodriguez's accident," Holloway replied, rising and adjusting his tie. "Now you have 1 hour. Sign or not, but know that without our specialized assistance, the effects of the chemical exposure will inevitably take their toll on you. Perhaps you'll lose control and crash into a bridge, or perhaps you'll decide to jump from one. Either way, your daughter will be without a father." "If I sign, can I see her?" "My daughter?" he asked, a faint glimmer of hope in his voice. "From a distance, without direct contact. That is necessary for operational security. But we can arrange targeted funds, anonymous college donations, so she will lack for nothing." Holloway left the contract on the bed and headed for the door. "1 hour, Sergeant. Consider the legacy you wish to leave. A hero who died from combat wounds, having secured his family for life, or a broken veteran who failed to adapt to civilian life, leaving them with nothing but debt and questions." The door closed, leaving the protagonist alone with the weight of his choice. Through the window, he could see other soldiers, relearning to walk, fighting for every step. They had returned home as heroes, and their families would never doubt their service and sacrifice. He picked up the pen 58 minutes later. His hand trembled as he signed his name, understanding that each letter was another bar in a golden cage from which he could not escape. The contract was signed the next morning. The money arrived within an hour. $278 million appeared in the account, as if by magic. A bank employee personally called to congratulate him on an inheritance from a distant relative. The lie was skillfully woven into the system. But Holloway didn't mention the main thing. By signing the contract, the protagonist was not only relinquishing his right to speak, but also the very ability to speak. 3 weeks later, Jameson called from a payphone in Missouri. "Riley, don't talk, just listen. Chen didn't kill himself. I talked to his girlfriend." He was trying to expose it, contacted a Washington Post reporter. And then he suddenly died. Rodriguez wasn't in an accident either. His sister says a black SUV hit him. "Someone's cleaning up, brother." The protagonist wanted to warn him, tell him to run, hide, leave the country. His mouth opened, words formed in his head, but they wouldn't come out, not a sound. His vocal cords felt locked. He tried to write, but his hand cramped and the pen fell from his fingers. The pencil broke in half as soon as it touched the paper. "Riley, are you there?" Jameson's voice grew more anxious. "I know you took the money. They said you signed, but I couldn't. They can't buy what we saw in that mountain." The words screamed in his head, but died in his throat. All he managed to utter was, "Be careful." Generic words, devoid of meaning, nothing about the truth. "I'm going underground tonight. They offered me money, showed me what they'd do to my daughter if I didn't sign. But some things are more important than money and safety. Someone has to remember what really happened. Someone has to tell the truth." The connection broke. It was the last time the protagonist heard Jameson's voice. That same night, Melinda called, for the first time since she left the ring on the bedside table. Her voice was different, filled with a fear he had never heard before. The call began with an unsettling message, filled with fear and confusion. Riley heard Melinda's voice on the phone, sounding as if she had encountered something utterly inexplicable. She spoke of suspicious individuals who had taken up residence near her home. 3 men, she claimed, were covertly observing her, and when confronted, introduced themselves as FBI agents. However, their demeanor and their knowledge of deeply personal details raised serious doubts. They knew their daughter's birth date, Melinda's mother's maiden name, and even a recent argument between the couple that had occurred shortly before Riley's last deployment. In despair, she posed a question that echoed in his mind. "What have you done? What happened there?" Riley tried to answer, but the familiar paralysis gripped his throat. Melinda, receiving no explanation, bitterly accused him of greed. She had learned about the money that, according to the unwelcome visitors, had set him up for life. She surmised that he had betrayed their family, abandoning his role as husband and father for financial prosperity. Had he traded his family for money? Riley was physically unable to defend himself. The words remained trapped in his throat, despite all his efforts. Melinda, convinced of his betrayal, hung up, leaving him in desperation. She believed he had sold out, becoming a mercenary who had traded his family for a hefty sum. The real shock came 6 months later. A courier delivered a package with no return address, not even waiting for a signature. Inside was a USB drive and a note written in Jameson's handwriting. "The truth they're hiding. Death timer activated. Use it wisely." The video on the flash drive revealed a horrifying truth. In crystal-clear footage, filmed from various angles, it captured the testing of American chemical weapons on civilians in an Afghan village, located just 20 meters from his unit's target. Bodies lay in the streets, and children's toys were scattered among the corpses. The chemicals used were the latest development, disguised as Soviet weapons, so that, in case of exposure, the blame could be shifted to old stockpiles. Riley's unit had accidentally stumbled upon a cleanup operation. They were not supposed to be there. The IED, intended to eliminate them, was meant to erase all traces. Smith and Jones were extracting evidence before international inspectors arrived. The explosion at the facility was their backup plan, in case anyone survived the IED blast. But Riley could not release this evidence. Any attempt to upload, email, or copy the files led to a physical shutdown of his body. Seizures, convulsions, loss of consciousness for several hours, temporary paralysis. All convinced him he was having strokes. They hadn't just bought their silence with money and threats. During operations in Germany, under the guise of saving lives and fitting prosthetics, they had implanted a neuroblocker in their nervous systems, which physically prevented the disclosure of specific information. He tried everything. He hired a hacker to remotely extract the files, but lost consciousness when he tried to provide the password. He attempted to leave the flash drive where someone might find it, but his legs gave out as soon as he tried to leave the house. Even attempts to write a fictional story that paralleled what had happened triggered a similar reaction. The technology was so advanced it seemed like science fiction, but it existed and controlled his brain, turning him into a prisoner in his own body. The money was merely a distraction. The real payment was to allow him to live in exchange for silence, regardless of his will. 2 years passed. Riley lived in a penthouse on the 32nd floor in Seattle, overlooking the bay, a view real estate agents dreamed of. His $800,000 prosthetics allowed him to participate in marathons, which he ran every month, raising funds for veteran charities. The donations were always anonymous. No one was supposed to know the source of these funds, though he had already donated $30 million. No trace remained in his account, and the interest exceeded his expenses. Melinda gave birth to a daughter 6 months after their separation and named her Grace. She sent a photo through Colton before cutting off all contact. In the picture, Grace had Riley's eyes and her mother's smile. This little person who would never know her real father. Melinda married a physical therapist named David, who ran a clinic specializing in helping wounded veterans. The irony was not lost on Riley. David was doing what Riley only pretended to do, being a true hero, helping real veterans, while Riley himself lived in his tower, built on blood money. He sent money through intermediaries, shell companies that donated funds to Grace's school, established untraceable trust funds. She could attend any college she chose, thanks to anonymous scholarships. Her medical bills were mysteriously paid. When she turned 25, she would inherit $10 million from a distant relative she never knew existed, but she would never know that this money was from a father who couldn't even explain why he left. And then came the moment when he had to leave his familiar world. 6 months ago, his father, Vernon, passed away. Lung cancer, like a cruel whirlwind, swiftly ended his earthly journey. At the funeral, standing by his father's grave in Arlington National Cemetery, his mother, squeezing his hand, whispered words full of love and understanding. "Riley, I see you're carrying a heavy burden. Whatever happened, I'm proud of you, son." His heart ached to tell her the truth, to explain why their meetings had become so rare, why his eyes held a perpetual wariness, why the past wouldn't release its grip. But the words stuck in his throat like ash. The neuroblocker worked flawlessly, allowing not a single sound to escape. Colton, a loyal friend, occasionally sent updates, photos from family gatherings where his presence was impossible. He naively believed that the reason for his estrangement was shame over his lost legs, a pride that prevented him from accepting sympathy. "Nobody cares about your prosthetics," he wrote in his last email. "We just want you back." If only he knew that the loss of his legs was only a small part of the bitter price he had paid in the mountains. Jameson is officially listed as missing in action, his name recorded among the fallen. His family held a memorial service last year, which he couldn't attend. But sometimes, like a greeting from the afterlife, postcards arrived from countries without extradition treaties. They contained no words, only coordinates marked in tiny numbers. He carefully plotted them on a map, creating a kind of constellation of places where his friend's ghost might be hiding. He hoped Jameson had found freedom and could tell the truth that he himself was unable to utter. This is the true cost of $278 million, absolute isolation disguised as luxury. He has access to everything except genuine human relationships built on truth. Every new relationship is a complex edifice of lies, constructed out of necessity. Last month, he hired a personal assistant, an energetic and cheerful young woman named Jennifer, who believes she works for a successful investor who made his fortune in cryptocurrency. When she asked about his prosthetics, he, without batting an eye, replied that they were the result of a motorcycle accident. The lie slipped out easily and naturally, for it contained no state secrets. But the most terrifying thing is the realization that somewhere in secret laboratories, this monstrous weapon continues to be created, tested on living people. There are other villages the world will never know about, other victims blamed on insurgent attacks or chemical leaks, and another unit, encountering the truth, will face the same agonizing choice: accept the money and allow evil to triumph, or refuse and disappear without a trace, like Chen and Rodriguez. Last week, in a coffee shop, a young veteran approached him, a guy in his mid-20s, missing his right arm, fresh from Walter Reed Hospital. "Sir, I recognized you from the IED incident. My unit is deploying to that same area next month. Can you give me any advice?" He wanted to scream, to beg him to refuse the deployment, to fake an injury, to desert, to do anything to avoid his fate. But instead, he merely managed to utter, "Come home whole, soldier." The guy smiled and thanked him for his service. As he left, he noticed a man in a black suit watching them from across the street. Not Holloway, but the same dead eyes, the same impeccable posture. They always watch, ensuring their investment remains in the shadows. $278 million. That was the price of his silence. But every morning, waking in his luxurious prison, looking at his daughter's photograph, knowing he could never hold her, remembering his fallen brothers who gave their lives for the truth, he understood they hadn't bought his silence, they had bought his soul, and the price was far too low.